Hello class, morning. Before we dive into Project 1 Milestone 2, just wanted to give you the general purpose of this, right? So the purpose of the whole project, it's to help us become better creative writers. So in that regard, we're learning about a classic work, and we're learning about a little bit like the author of that classic work. In regard to the author's choices that he or she made at the time and why they made those choices, well, for their work. So for instance, say I was analyzing something like The Hobbit from Tolkien, so then I would want to understand, well, where does Tolkien come from? I mean, not like his parents, right? There's the smart ass answer. But more like, where is he coming from his history, his society, his culture? That'll help me give me some background on Tolkien. And that might also give me some insight into the choices he made for The Hobbit. So in many ways, this assignment is charging us to get inside the head of these authors of our works, at least to see the world from their perspective during their time. And then the hope there is that we'll learn more about creative writing and in turn reflect on our own creative writing and be more informed on our own decisions for our own writing. So with that said, let's dive into the rubric. I just made this video here to go over this week's assignment and little details, hopefully to provide some clarification. Please ignore my many tabs up here. That's just kind of how I like to work. But we're going to be focusing on this, which I hope you've already taken a look at. So let's dive in. So I'm just going to zoom in here so we get a closer look. Alright, so I don't want to focus too much on the overview of the prompt. I'm going to assume that you went ahead and look at them, but also I feel this is going to be where the questions lie. This area where we break down the different parts and what's expected in the assignment. Alright, so first thing first, this is on your classic work, as it says here, yeah. And please feel free to use any resources you would like about your classic work. Especially when we get to literary conventions, when we talk about this, it'll be okay to use outside resources as long as you cite them in MLA format in order to help build your analysis. That's perfectly fine. So let's start here with A, where it's asking for the storytelling elements. That's the stuff we covered last week, Module 3, I think. And this is talking about the narrative structure in these parts. So we have this from last week, and then also this week is the character development. Well, this week we have a little bit of character development. Some of it's also on narrative voice. Often those things overlap, but not always. So here you're just examining things we talked about in Module 3 and Module 4. Some questions you might have with this narrative structure, if you have like a nonfiction work, for example, or poetry, though I don't think anybody chose an epic poem, though I can't remember off the top of my head. The structure might not be as explicit as in our example stories we read, where there's a clear conflict, oftentimes a clear physical conflict, right, in crisis and resolution. Sometimes it's implied or behind the scenes. So for instance, in some nonfiction pieces, it might just be a collection of letters sent back and forth. I'm thinking of books like Letters to a Young Poet. And that doesn't really have an explicit conflict because everything's talked about in letter form. But in the letters, the subtext, there is an overarching arc, like plot development, an overarching theme that ties all the letters together. And then this is kind of what we're looking for the narrative structure, the thing that ties all of these seemingly unconnected parts together. Because obviously, if the author put all of these letters or seemingly unconnected essays in a collection, the author believes that they're connected somehow and that they do have a structure that forms them. So even in nonfiction and other pieces, more experimental, there will be a narrative structure, though it won't be as explicit as we've seen in our examples. If you have questions about that, this is where you can consult outside resources, of course, see what others have examined, especially on classic works. And this could be utilizing the library, right, the Shapiro Library, or Google Scholar, or Google itself, or Wikipedia, just to get an idea of what the ideas, concepts for the narrative structure and whatever work you're working with. So in any case, storytelling elements is one thing you'll be analyzing. One other thing I'm going to point out here with my my yellow cursor here are these word choices. So we have analyze, evaluate, determine, and then back to evaluate. And those are purposely done. Analyze is you're going to be examining these storytelling elements and then using evidence from your classic work to back it up. Right, so if you say something like the conflict happens at a certain point, well then you use evidence to back it up, hence an analysis. And when I say evidence, this could be evidence from the classic work itself, so that would be original resources, or it could be evidence from secondary resources. And then we have evaluate. So evaluate is more of where your own opinion comes into play. Evaluate how these storytelling elements function together in the classic work. So here's your take on, after you've analyzed them, you can explain if you think they're working well, and if they are working well, why do you think that? Or if they don't work so well together, why do you think that, right, in contrast. And then we have this next part here, which is determine how the author's choice relate to literary conventions of the time. This is one where I imagine many people will need to do some resource, depending on how old their classic research, depending on how old their classic work is. Here, right, like if I were to do a classic work from any of the early 20th century, I definitely would want to do some historical research to figure out movements of the time, what was happening at the time. When I say movements, like social movements, which also overlap with literary movements, and then how does this work fit into that puzzle, fit into those historical and literary elements. And then once I figure that out, right, then I could say, well, does this book use some of those conventions of the time? Is it purposely going against those conventions of the time, kind of like a counter-convention thing? What's happening? So in my own mind, again, this part C is where I imagine where most people will need to consult outside resources and research, and that's perfectly fine. Feel free to do that. So to summarize this part, first you got to figure out the literary conventions of the time. And then you're going to find, well, not find out, but you're going to then say whether this author in this particular work adhered to the conventions or did not, as you say here, rejected or adopted the conventions, and then provide evidence of it from the work, classic work itself, where these conventions were adopted or where they were rejected. Remember, just like the journals, when I posted about the journals, always provide examples showing what you mean. So always, you could tell me that yes, the author did adhere to the literary conventions of so-and-so. But then show it using examples from the work, or secondary sources that use examples from the work, or some kind of evidence that demonstrates that claim. I guess a common movie quote I used at that time comes from Training Day by Denzel Washington. You may have heard of it or not, but it's kind of, he says, it's not what you know, it's what you can show. So if you think about that in your writing, in your work here, I don't know what you know unless you show it, is another way to say it. So moving off that tangent, we go to the last part where again we have the word evaluate again. So here's coming in where you bring in your own opinions on the work. And then here you're evaluating how these storytelling elements from here help create the intended theme. So by this point, you'll want to have an idea of what the intended theme was. Now, intended theme, it's not exactly a word choice that I like so much, because that means you know what the author intended for a theme. And in many cases, we will never know that. We can guess based on evidence and based on the time period. There's pretty likely choices and unlikely choices. So here, elements to create its theme. So here you want to decide what its major theme for your work is, and then relate back the storytelling elements to the theme, explaining and telling me how you think they help the theme, build the theme, or they're an obstacle to building that particular theme, or if they're both, right? So these four, the A, B, C, D, right? These four things here, I'll be looking for in the assignment. They're also reflected again in the rubric. So another thing here is to look at the guidelines for submission, because this is our task. This is what we want to accomplish within our paper. And then we have this, so I come down here, 3 to 4 pages in length, and that's in MLA format. Which in MLA format, I think that's about 750 to 1,000 words. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. So what that means, if you were to break it down to this, is each one of these gets a page. You have to be able to analyze these storytelling elements and all of A in one page time. Same with this and this and this. Of course, it's not going to be divided that neatly, but if I were, I guess if I were in your shoes, it's kind of how I would tackle it. I would look at the space I have, what are the things I need to put inside that space, and then what would be the average length for each of these, which would be 1 page. Of course, looking at some of these, maybe like this evaluate one, you might start to guess, well, maybe you don't need a whole page for that. And maybe things like C, depending on how much resources you have already or research, you might need a page, a little more than a page, or maybe even a little less, right? This is all going to depend on your own particular classic work, what you found in your research, and what you want to say. Keep in mind, you can go a little over. That's fine. I'm not a big stickler on length, or if it's just a little bit over. Of course, if it's double the length, that's an issue. But yeah, if you go a little bit over, a little under, things get a little iffy then, because then I don't know if you have enough for all of these things if you go under. But I can understand if you're having trouble fitting all of these in 4 pages. Alright, well, I hope that little walkthrough has been helpful. Please feel free to leave, if you have any general comments on the assignment, in the discussion board, the general one, so many people, well, we can all see it. If you have particular questions, feel free to email me about them. So see you in the discussions. Cheers.